So in this video, I'm going to do a quick overview of the well header table that has been provided as part of the competition. It's found in both the classification and the regression challenge. I'll just go through the items one by one, kind of show you what they are, have a quick discussion on what you can do with them. And if you have any other questions, feel free to bring them up in the forums. So you can see here, I've loaded up the data set, in this case in Power BI for the Power Query end, but you can use whatever tool it is you want. And just starting from the left here, we can see EP Assets ID. That is your primary key. This is your indicator for each individual row. You'll notice quite next to that you've got license number and UWI. UWI commonly being the key that industry will use to identify wells. Just recognize that those are not always unique. So what we usually do in industry, at least on my end, is what we'll do is we'll join things by EPS ID as an effective primary key and then reference our results according to UWI, just so it's translated into industry speak. From there, you'll have a license number. Recognize that well, not each, but several of the license numbers will have multiple UWIs per license. And the idea being that the license represents kind of a surface location for the well. Think of it as the hole in the ground. And you'll have multiple well legs kicking off from that hole. So you'll have multiple legs, which are UWIs, tied to individual license numbers, representing a single area unit of production. Continuing along, of course, we have the province here, the operator of the well, as well as a roll-up to their parent ID. So if you have a company that is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 Alberta Limited, you can roll that up to identify the parent company that owns that company, and therefore kind of roll up to a greater perspective on the operator itself. You'll see in a couple situations here where there is no current operator as the result. It's important to flag these results as they might be an indication of an inactive well or something going on there that has put the well in kind of a limbo state. If we continue forward, we see the licensee of the well. So the operator is the company that runs the well. The licensee is the company that's responsible for the liability associated with that well. Now, frequently, the licensee will operate their own well, but in some cases, they will farm it out to an operating company. Continuing along, we've got the, again, licensee ID, so we can roll up for the parent companies. License date, so this is the date when the well was licensed. Recognize that a licensed well does not need to be drilled. So if you have a license but no spud date, then the well hasn't actually been drilled, and it's kind of a ghost well or a paper well. The type of well and a standardized roll-up on the type of well, identifying what is being pursued here. And so you'll see production types like gas, oil, water, or etc. But you'll also see things like injection, drainage, or service. Be aware of those and recognize that some of them have different production profiles and operational standards, and therefore have different objectives and might filter differently in your model. Confidential release date, it's important to recognize that some wells are drilled in areas that are considered to be proprietary, and there's some new data to come out of those. So companies will file to have the well not report any new information for a set period of time. The confidential release date is when that well came off of the confidentiality period. So you'll want to look for confidential type wells and identify if they have the release date and whether the period you're investigating is before that release date. Because it might be that if your model is triggering off of a well that isn't reporting data, but it's in a confidentiality period, it might just be that the well hasn't been put forward in there. Looking at surface abandonment date, that's something you can train off of to identify abandoned wells. Looking at the date when the surface was abandoned, but not necessarily reclaimed, so it won't show a full abandonment. Well name. Honestly, I would recommend just deleting these columns. They are just arbitrary names that companies will assign to their properties. They change hands. If they don't really mean anything, stick with the UWIs and the EP asset IDs. Field pool formation. These are indicators of your surface and subsurface locations. So if you're looking at the formation, that's the geological formation being targeted by the well. The field is more of a arbitrary surface location that's identified by the operator. And then a pool will be kind of a subset within the formation. And combined, you can kind of look at those and identify play regions or different subset pockets that companies are targeting that might have similar characteristics. Now, surface location and survey system, this is going to identify effectively whether the property is in BC or Alberta, but identifies the survey system that's being used for the location, and then you have your tag out here and your breakdown for the location according to the DLS or NTS systems. Different components to help you georectify all that information. Lat longs on the surface, you'll also find bottom hole prefaced by BH, we'll find that in a second. More breakouts for the regions, I'll just click along here. So NTS in these wells we were looking at were DLS, so we don't have NTS components because they're DLS, so keep that in mind. They're going to be not applicable in a lot of cases. Here's your bottom hole characteristics, identifying where the base of the well is versus the top on the surface location. Again, no NTS here. Not long for that bottom hole. Taking a look here, Kelly bushing elevation and ground elevation of the well might be relevant, depending on if you're looking at for condensation rates. I wouldn't really worry about it too much, but it's there. Total depth, recognize that this is the total depth of the well and will include horizontal length. So we'll find two depth metrics in here. Total depth is the entire length of the well. Total vertical depth is going to be the depth. And then recognize that there isn't a kickoff point metric in here, this particular data set. So you might want to do some extrapolation to be looking at horizontal lengths to identify whether or not it's a long lateral or a short. Perhaps that might indicate if it's a modern well. Leahy class will identify a bit more about the objective of the well. Is it meant to be a development? Is it a wildcat exploration well? Just giving some context on what the business objective behind that well is. And then here you have a tag for confidentiality to identify whether it is a confidential or non-confidential well. Surface owner information as to whether or not it's on freehold or crown land in most cases. Tags as to whether or not the well is in an oil sands deposit or area. If it's not applicable, it's not in an oil sands region. Recognize that just because a well is in an oil sands region does not mean it is a unconventional well. There are conventional wells producing in the oil sands region that still take advantage of steam drive from neighboring projects. So there's a bit of nuance there, but definitely a useful flag for identifying wells pursuing unconventional objectives. Flag here for the name of the drilling contractor that drilled this particular well, the date when it was drilled, the final drill date being when the drill is done, but usually we actually recommend using rig release date. A little bit of nuance there, but effectively a better capture of when the rig moves off the site. And so you can look at spud to rig release date as being effectively the life cycle between drilling times. Recognize that these numbers start to get a little wonky once you factor in pad drills. Pad drills are not well reported in the current environment, and so the spud and rig release dates for a pad will be quite off. They'll be very strange, and there's ways to work around that, but I'll leave that to you to identify and figure out. Continuing on. Drilling days, so that's just spud to rig release measure there. Meters drilled per day. Again, just kind of a quick measure off of these metrics. Might not be useful metrics because of that pad drilling issue we just identified. TVD is your total vertical depth, so this is your top to base, whereas the total depth metric will include the lateral length. Well profile, is it a vertical, directional, or horizontal well? Might be useful for identifying the characteristics of the life cycle of the well. A horizontal well might last a little bit longer than a vertical, or a vertical might be old and really need to be reclaimed. Well symbol part 1, I mean, this is a bit of an error on our part. We were supposed to remove this field, but we didn't get around to it. This is just a file or a category we use for our Esri mapping system. It just tags the well as being an oil gas type well. It's effectively the same as well type, and I would actually recommend removing this one. But you're welcome to use it if you think there's something that comes out of it. All of the wells in this database are going to be tied to Canada, so country is not necessarily great, but the regulatory agencies will be relevant because they will be reflective of the province they're in. Very similar to the workflow you'll find with the province column, though, so perhaps that's redundant. Number of wells is just an aggregator here that we use, so probably can just delete it. It will be 1 per UWI, so it won't be too big of an issue here. PSAC area code, you can Google the map for this one, but PSAC regions are arbitrary boundaries that were created by the Petroleum Service Alliance of Canada to identify surface areas with different characteristics. It's a very broad area and kind of used behind province. So you do province PSAC, and then perhaps you look at formation and pool to identify a play subset, but just kind of a nice way to bin up areas within the provinces. And here we have the names tied to those PSAC codes. Projected depth, this is the depth that is assigned to a well at its license point. So the idea being that this is the depth they're hoping to hit, and then the total depth is what they'll actually wind up with after they drill the well. The status date is the date when the last status was updated. Might be useful if you're looking at wells that haven't been updated for a while, and the source of when this came through based off of our various research angles. Unit ID and unit name. Sometimes wells will be unitized across groups of multiple operators. They form kind of a consortium. This tag will identify the unit that the well is tied into with an ID and a name. And then there's a flag here as to whether or not the well has been unitized. Municipalities, just if we have a tag for the municipality the well is located in, we'll have it here. Completion date, I would actually recommend getting rid of this one compared to rig release date, and the idea being that this is not the fracture date of the well. This is the date when the well is deemed completed by the board report that comes in through the regulators. Pretty much just when the well is finished drilling. A little bit inconsistently reported. Would really recommend using rig release date instead of this one. If there's a land agent, they'll have that tied through. And here we have our characteristics for things like the max production of the well, which is effectively your initial production rate. A count of number of fracture stages if we're able to pull it through. And don't mind the text category there. This is an integer, just Power BI didn't read anything out the gate, so just automatically classified that as text. Don't worry about that. A very quick detail on whether the well is open hole or cased completed. And if we can, a count of the number of completion events tied into the well. Again, giving you a little bit of an idea of the completion and fracture profile that is tied to this property. Now, at the end of the day, what you're going to do with this is use it for your classification exercise, but recognize this table is also relevant to the regression analysis. What you'll want to do for the regression exercise is join in the production tables against EPS and ID here, and then filter out the wells that are non-existent, because the regression exercise only has a handful of a couple thousand wells, whereas this is all the wells. So you want to filter that out, and this will give your characteristics to test off of for both exercises, with the test vector just being in the other data set. And again, if you have any questions here, what I'd say is feel free to reach out over the forums. We try to keep an eye on them as much as we can, and happy to answer any questions that pop up. Good luck.